topics as always. And in this one, you can kind of see from the title, very serious one, right? And unfortunately, when it comes to YouTube in specific, they have a tendency to, at best, this video may just get restricted, because the kind of content that I'm doing with this is of course educational. So it's not anything that's gonna, or at least doesn't have the intention to promote this type of, these type of activities and things like that. So unfortunately, that at best that's what's gonna happen here, but it is something that still does need to be talked about, right? So I won't be of course depicting anything that promotes that, so that is of course within guidelines and whatnot. Anything that when it comes to eating disorders, anything that I would depict would of course have to get blurred out, but since I'm not depicting anything, that won't be an issue here. So it's still something that's got to be talked about. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't educate, right? So we're gonna go ahead and talk about eating disorders. This is gonna be a two-part video, right? Now this first part is basically gonna sort of give you some background as always, right? More broken down background and things like that. And it's gonna talk about how, how that relates to sports. And then in the next part, I'll actually do an application of sorts and go into treatment. That's gonna be the part 2, okay? So to go ahead and get us started, we have what is commonly known as 3 different types of eating disorders, starting with anorexia, right? Bulimia nervosa, and then you have binge eating disorder. They're the most commonly known ones, right? Between 1 to 19% of the adult and adolescent population experience this. Now that's about equal to 24 million Americans. And activities such as beauty pageants or even in like the supermodel world and things like that, it typically tends to be the more younger white females that go through these types of eating disorders. Now, make no mistake, eating disorders don't really know any culture or race or background, but they're more experienced by the young white females. So examples of certain behaviors, okay, is of course binging, restrained eating, and certain compensatory behaviors. So to go into what these are, binging of course is where you're eating a whole lot and then there's no control, right, over when you reach satiety, which is another name for fullness, and you keep doing so, you keep binging, maybe to the point where you get yourself sick or something like that. So that's what binging is, okay? Restrained eating is essentially like where you'll eat something but you'll sort of try to restrain yourself, maybe to the point where you're not getting the caloric intake that you need. It's more common with anorexia, given that there's a psychological behavior where you're just kind of like, okay, I don't want to look this way. It's more of a perception, right? I don't want to look this way, so I'm gonna just not eat this much, or I'll only eat this much, rather, I'll say. It's kind of like that. That's restrained eating, to where you're really restraining yourself to where you're not enjoying you're not engaging in normal eating, of course, which I'm going to go into when I get to that bullet. But then you also have compensatory behaviors. So what compensatory behaviors are is basically in the name. It's behaviors that sort of overcompensate for you trying not to look a certain way, when you're going through certain eating disorders. So compensatory behaviors, examples of those might be excessive exercise, right, or under eating. Just like, again, like restrained eating, that's a compensatory behavior. Not eating the amount that your body needs in order to sustain itself and your body's life cycle. So that's compensatory behavior. Another one would be, abuse of laxatives. Another one, obviously, which is common with bulimia, is vomiting after eating. Another compensatory behavior might be increasing the use of diuretics, right? Which of course increases the amount of urine your body produces. You're trying to increase excretion of urine. So those are all compensatory behaviors. So what is normal eating, right? Well, normal eating is basically, how do I put it? You basically eat, to the point where you eat no matter what your emotions are, right? Whether you're happy, whether you're sad, whether you're anxious, you still know that you have to eat, right? But with normal eating, there's usually always some form of control. Okay, that's the difference. Normal eating is, you leaving, like you eat some cookies on a plate, right? And maybe you leave a few for tomorrow, or you maybe eat them all, but then you don't have any tomorrow. That's what that means, right? That's basically like what normal eating essentially is defined as in some senses, okay? Normal eating is, you eat enough to make sure that you're nice and full, and maybe you even overeat just a little bit, but then you're also, making sure you're not overeating too much. But then at the same time, you're making sure that you're not restraining yourself, right? You're making sure that you're not missing out on what it is that you do enjoy, okay? As I always say in my videos, everything is about a balance, right? So even when, people who get on meal plans and things like that, there's always still, well, unless of course you're training to be a bodybuilder and you're trying to step up on stage and compete, you typically don't always have room for cheat meals like that. If you're just working out for lifestyle and you want to, just lose weight or whatever the case may be, you don't have intention of stepping on stage and you're just working out, trying to get healthier, get more fit, personal trainers for the most part they'll put you on a meal plan, but they'll try to ensure that your plan entails you eating the things that you don't mind eating, right? Of course, healthy foods, right? Unprocessed and, whole foods, fruits, veggies, and things like that, and certain meats as well. But they'll also make room for you to have cheat meals. Some trainers, I know a lot of the trainers I talk to, some of them say that they'll, administer like one cheat meal a week, or some of them will even give their clients an entire cheat day. It just depends on what the plan entails, so that's basically normal eating. You're not depriving yourself, right? So normal eating isn't you always just eating healthy foods either. That's basically the point I'm trying to get across here. You're not always just eating everything healthy. That's not, normal eating. That's a sort of a misconception in a sense. You can make room for some of the things that aren't the greatest for you. Maybe you feel like you haven't had it in a while. Maybe you want to go out and get a burger and fries. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're not doing it a whole lot. You're not doing it excessively. Oftentimes we hear about, in the fitness and nutrition world, in the sports realm, of course, you hear about the 80-20 rule. So you eat about 80%, healthy foods, that being whole foods, lean foods, right? Lean meats, fruits, veggies. And then the other 20% can be the stuff that's not that great for you to have excessively, but it's okay for you to have about 20% of your time, right? So that would be like your chocolates and your refined sugars, right? That cookie you want so bad, that cake, that dessert, it's okay to have that. That's what normal eating is. Balance, right? Pretty much balanced eating. The disorder types, okay? So I already wrote the types, but we're gonna go ahead and define them now. So first, I want to talk about the DSM-5 standards. So it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. That's what that stands for. Now, the DSM-5, the reason why that's important is because they're a part of the American Psychological Association, if I'm not mistaken. And they essentially have criteria that defines whether or not you have a specific type of disorder. I'm gonna go ahead and add this in the video, of course, but I didn't want to write it all down because, as you can see, you should be seeing it now. It's kind of a lot. This table I actually created myself and printed it out. So we're gonna start with anorexia. So the first bullet in each category, each column, the first bullet is the definition of each disorder. So the first bullet in anorexia says significant weight loss, fright of becoming fat, and distorted body image, which may also be known as dysmorphia. Usually that's the one criteria that of course comes up under DSM-5 standards that may diagnose you as anorexic. This could also cause amenorrhea in women and of course sexual impotence in men. For those of you that don't know what amenorrhea is, I imagine my women may know, but for those of you that don't, men or women, amenorrhea is basically in women the absence of a period, especially for an extended period of time. Being anorexic, obviously it throws off your hormone. That's, the absence of a period, which, throws off your cycles because your hormones are thrown off and now you got to get them back on track. Just some of the things that help DSM-5 or to help, I guess like dietitians and clinicians and things like that, doctors. These are some of the things that will help them sort of diagnose you, better. It's also a disorder that utilizes most compensatory behaviors. So the other two may only utilize maybe like one or two, but anorexia is the one that, utilizes majority of the compensatory behaviors that I mentioned earlier. So with anorexia, you do get, the vomiting. That is one, when you go straight to the restroom or whatever, and, right after somebody eats. Of course, being significantly underweight, that's a criteria of the DSM-5. There's also, of course, the use of diuretics. Excessive exercise is another one, especially excessive exercise in relation to your calorie intake. Laxative abuse. So when you're abusing laxatives so much. It's also got a 4% mortality rate, which is equal to 1 in 5, right? So 1 in 5, specifically, it's the women though that are affected by this, as I mentioned. But as you can see in the next bullet, they do affect different cultures and backgrounds, i.e., bisexual and gay men. And the reason for that, is something I actually didn't think about, but it was, in my course material when I was in school for this. Bisexual and gay men oftentimes can have the same outlook or the same perception on looks as women, right? They can kind of look at themselves the same way as women do, and they may think, oh, I'm too fat, or, even if they're skinny, they pinch a little, something, maybe an oblique, a side, a love handle or something like that, and they may decide, to take extreme measures. The next one we have is bulimia. Now that first bullet, the definition, is known as repetitive eating followed through with compensatory behaviors. Now, I wrote, of course, some of the same compensatory behaviors that I mentioned. The criteria by DSM-5 includes engaging in these behaviors once a week every 3 months. Usually it's triggered by emotions, right? So bulimia is usually the one triggered by emotions the most. Be it sadness, anger, depression, guilt, especially guilt, right? Oftentimes with anorexia and bulimic, individuals, they tend to feel some sense of guilt when they go to eat a certain type of food, right? Or when they eat an amount of food that they deem, I guess, not feasible for them. And also, it's the more subtle disorder, given that there are no obvious changes in weight. So anorexia, of course, being extremely underweight is a criteria, whereas with binge eating disorder that I'm going to get to in a minute, usually with binge eating disorder, because you're eating so much, right, obesity is a criteria. Well, with bulimia, typically weights don't fluctuate the same way the other two do. Even as a bulimic person, when you eat food and then you go to get rid of it right afterwards, there's still, I believe it's about 1,200 calories, last I read, that still sticks with you. Okay, so about 1,200 calories can still be retained in your body even after getting rid of said food. That's why with bulimia, that's the one that, it's the more subtle disorder, because it's the one that, takes a little bit longer to diagnose you with. And 1 to 3% of the population experience this. As you can imagine, 90% are female. Now we have binge eating disorder. So the first bullet, the definition would be consuming large amounts of food over short periods, and that has been defined as 2-hour periods. Also feeling no control, right, when you're eating, followed by shame or guilt. Same DSM-5 criteria as bulimia, all right? So what that means is, even with binge eating disorder, they're engaging in these behaviors once a week every 3 months, just like with bulimia. That's a criteria by the DSM-5 that can, get you a diagnosis for binge eating disorder. Now, it's common in all racial and cultural groups. Now, it's usually triggered by depression, anxiety, and stress. All right, y'all, I had to take just a little bit of a break. I had to go take my hoodie off. All the temperature changes over here. All of a sudden, it was cold, and then, it's hot. So I'm on this side of the board now. Something else that I didn't really want to write all over the board was the comorbidities now that come with eating disorders. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. I'm not going to go over all of these. You can pretty much see this, for yourself here. But I'm going to just basically sort of go into why some of these things happen, so that way you have a better idea, more well-rounded, perspective as to why these things happen. So I'm going to start with anorexia, right? So as you can imagine, each eating disorder affects different systems of your body: cardiovascular, digestive system and kidneys, endocrine system, as well as your musculoskeletal system. With anorexia, right, you could be looking at hypotension, which is abnormally low blood pressure. You're looking at an irregular heartbeat, bradycardia. Now, for those of you that don't know what bradycardia is, that's the condition as to where during the day, your heart rate drops below 50 beats per minute, and at night, a little lower than 46. So it's basically an abnormally low heartbeat. Atrophy is loss of muscle, but cardiac myopathy is, the loss of muscle around your heart, right? Because, your heart has muscles too. So your heart muscle starts to deteriorate at that point in time. Electrolyte abnormalities if purging, that's quite obvious because, when you purge, you lose out on electrolytes, okay? You end up dehydrating yourself. And as I mentioned in I believe it was the hypertension video, what happens is your body does, I can't remember what it was called now, unfortunately, but your body goes into a state where it tries to retain as much sodium as humanly possible because sodium, like potassium, is one of your body's main electrolytes. So, when there's no electrolytes in your body, you're getting dehydrated, it tends to try to retain as much sodium as humanly possible. Digestive in the kidneys, you could be looking at bloating and constipation, okay, for obvious reasons. Then you have your endocrine system, okay, amenorrhea, which I mentioned already, amenorrhea for women, fatigue, and hypoglycemia, which is abnormally low blood sugar, okay. Musculoskeletal, that's osteopenia, osteoporosis, stress fracture, stunted growth, and muscle wasting. Now you can imagine these happen because, with anorexia, you're not getting the nutrients that your body needs in order for you to, like for example, with osteoporosis, that's loss of calcium in your bones. So your bones start becoming weak, right, and brittle. Well, when you're, especially if you're purging during, an anorexia diagnosis, you're letting go a lot of the vitamins and minerals, be it calcium, vitamin D, right, specifically, and even phosphorus, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the minerals and vitamins your body needs in order to be able to maintain the strong bones and teeth as well. Now to go into bulimia, cardiovascular type, you got arrhythmias, you have palpitations, cardiac myopathy, electrolyte abnormalities, right? And then in the digestive system, erosion of tooth enamel, chipped teeth, dental caries. All of those basically kind of obvious when you think about bulimia and what is entailed with it. For those of you that don't know, when you throw up a lot, you end up, your enamel, your teeth enamel, they end up decaying because stomach acid comes up with it. The stomach acid burns your enamel, so your teeth no longer have that protection. So that's what can happen, erosion of teeth enamel, dental caries, chipped teeth. You can end up losing your teeth altogether. It affects your digestive tract. Food isn't really supposed to keep coming up the way that, a person who has bulimia is making it. So, ending up with GI bleeding is quite, it's quite an obvious cause. For the endocrine system, you got menstrual irregularity, right? So amenorrhea can, still of course occur in women, even with bulimia, not just with anorexia. Binge eating disorder, okay? Hypertension, which is of course high blood pressure. And then you have high blood lipids. If y'all remember from my cholesterol video, I talked about LDL and HDL. You got low density lipoproteins, which is the bad cholesterol. High density lipoproteins is the other one, which is good cholesterol. So high blood lipids in binge eating disorder, chances are you're increasing your LDL levels because the foods that you eat, oftentimes with binge eating disorder, the foods that are consumed aren't the healthiest either, right? They're just, they typically tend to be highly processed. They tend to be like a bunch of cakes, desserts, refined sugars, artificial flavoring and sweeteners. They tend to be the stuff that's not that healthy for you. And those foods I just mentioned, or foods that have those ingredients, are the very types of foods that raise your LDL levels. Then you got digestive system. Binge eating disorder affects your body through, by giving you dental caries, even gum disease and gallbladder disease. And then you have, for the endocrine system, type 1 diabetes mellitus. For my diabetes video, you got type 1 and type 2. Type 2 is the one that is the one that can be reversed. But once you have type 1, there's nothing you can do about that usually, okay? That's why it's called a rare case. Most people, the most common type of diabetes is type 2. But once you get type 1, what that means is you're now at a point where you have to inject insulin, or you have to take it by a pump of some sort. You have to take insulin externally. And now, last but not least, I want to end this with going into some sports-related items, okay? So, we have here what's called the female athlete triad. Basically what this is it consists of 3 different conditions. You'll notice it consists of disordered eating, osteoporosis, and amenorrhea. Now, as you'll notice, the disordered eating is nutritional, the osteoporosis is musculoskeletal, and the amenorrhea is the endocrine. About 10 to 15% of high school boys in sports experience disordered eating. And the reason why that is because of a result of sports requirements. So many of you, including myself, that have played sports, you may typically, especially not all sports, football is one, wrestling is definitely another, even professional boxing, amateur boxing as well, just boxing in general, even UFC, MMA. There are sports that require you to make a certain type of weight based on your class, right? Whatever class you're fighting in or wrestling in or whatever the case may be, that's the reason as to why oftentimes a lot of high school boys, about 10 to 15% anyway, will experience disordered eating as a way to try to make weight. 8% of elite/college women experience disordered eating, with 25% having partial cases. Okay, because again, with the DSM-5, criteria, you may not have full-blown eating disorder of any type. You may have a partial case. And what I forgot to mention, there's another one that's most recently added. This one it hasn't been around as long as the other three, but there's another one now called atypical anorexia. And what that basically consists of is someone who meets the same conditions as anorexia, except the difference is obese or overweight at least. Because it has now recently come out that for anorexia, you don't have to just be underweight and like really, really thin. You can even be overweight and still have anorexia, because you can be overweight and still have all of the other symptoms. You can still have all the other compensatory behaviors. That's called atypical anorexia. So it's basically, same conditions except the person is overweight. With anorexia, persons typically tend to be skinny. They tend to be highly underweight, right? Significantly. I'm gonna end off here with a little story, right? This is a little story I read about in my course material. College men, right? So I wrote these basically to just sort of help me along in the story a little bit, but this was around 1997, right? And it was around November, December time frame. So there were 3 college men, right? And they were all wrestlers. So 2 of them, one weighed 178 and the other weighed 180 pounds. They were hoping to fight in the 153-pound weight class. The 3rd wrestler, he weighed 223 and he was hoping to wrestle at the 195-pound class. As a result of, the rapid weight loss and, of course, their essentially disordered eating, right? As a result of their extreme measures, they passed away, right? Each of them died. So they died around November, December time frame of 1997. They died, due to complications of hypothermia, cardiac stress, and rapid and excessive weight loss. Now, since then, okay, the NCAA changed their rules around a little bit ever since this incident happened. They've since raised the class a little bit, right? They've allowed, they've allowed sports folks to compete at a higher, weight class. They've banned the use of saunas and suit bags, those bags that people like to wear to sweat a lot in. They've banned the use of those, especially right before a competition. So, they've had to make some changes, of course, to make sure that this did not happen again. Maybe I'll put the link, in this video somewhere or in the description perhaps. It may come from family, but it also may come from, like classmates, especially if, we're talking about minors, we're talking about kids. It may come from other classmates. I think we've all grown up, at some point or another, and we've seen people get made fun of for being, heavier, or maybe they're trying to lose and they, best case scenario, it's a motivator for people to lose weight, but that's not always the case. And that's what's important for us to remember. It doesn't necessarily help if we don't have the empathy and the compassion when we lack those, for people that are trying to do something about it. These eating disorders, they ultimately, lead to the grave. So, it's not something that, you want on your conscience, right? Just to, if you're one of those types that made fun of others, or, it's not something you really want on your conscience, right? It's essentially a part of bullying, and I know that's a story for another day, right? But, bullying in the workplace or at school, it exists everywhere, online too. Be kind to everyone, and, always support people in their journeys. And that's why I'm here. So, you know, I want to support everybody in their journey, whatever that looks like for you. So if you're trying to lose weight, maybe put on muscle, or just overall, you know, learn how to eat healthier, you know, that's what I try to do. That's what I'm here for. So, but that's pretty much going to be it. If this video happened to be a trigger for you, you know, I apologize in advance, you know, but it's important that y'all know, right, my intention is to educate. And if any of you out there have went through any of this yourself, then, you know, don't be afraid to share your stories. I mean, obviously, you got to be the one that's comfortable with that. You sharing your story would help somebody else that maybe is going through it and has no idea where to go. Like they have no direction, no guidance, you know, of how to get out of that rut that they're stuck in. Okay, and hopefully, you know, for those of you out there that have experienced it, maybe you can reach someone else before, you know, they get to a point where it's too late, where they can't do nothing about it. I'm going to see y'all on part 2. Thank y'all very much for tuning in. Y'all have a great rest of y'all day.